in this series that we have simply called what? I've repeated it for you every week, and it's right on the screen behind me. Be Love, right. And so just kind of pop quiz for you, a couple things. I've tried to repeat some of the background very quickly every week for you. I think repetition's good for us. Maybe you're tired of hearing it, but perhaps you could be able to kind of repeat some of it back to me, some of the things that I've shared with you every week. Our series called Be Love is based on some words actually written by an early church leader 2,000 years ago, a guy by the name of, anyone know? Paul, good. And we've talked a little bit about Paul. I don't ever want to take it for granted that you all know who he is and all that he was about. So I try to remind you every week that Paul was an early church leader and started as an enemy of the church, was trying to wipe out this whole movement of Jesus thing. And yet Jesus got a hold of his life and radically changed his life. And he went on to tell really so many people all around the known world all about Jesus. And he started churches in all sorts of cities and towns. And one of those towns was the ancient city. The letter that we're talking about here was written to this church here. It was in the ancient city of, anyone know? Corinth, okay, in modern day Greece. And Paul wrote this letter to a church he helped start there. It was a church loaded with potential. So many good things happening, so much potential for so many more good things to happen. And yet Paul recognized there's a lot of dysfunction, a lot of challenges in the church that he needed to address. And so he wrote them a letter. And we actually have the letter that he wrote to them in our Bibles. We call it 1 Corinthians, and written to the church there in Corinth. And he addressed all sorts of things throughout the book. And then at the end of the book, in chapter 16, toward the very end of this, verses 13 and 14, he gave them kind of a summary. He gave them 5 short challenges that in many ways summarize so much of what he talked about all throughout his letter, all throughout the book that we have there. And I've been pointing these out to you in chapter 16, verses 13 and 14. He said to be on guard, to stand firm in the faith, to be courageous, to be strong, as we talked about together last spring. And then this one we've been focusing on over these weeks together this winter here, to do everything with love. And so that's what we've been talking about. What does it look like for us to do that, to do everything to love, or to do everything with love, or as we've described it with just our series title, to be love to people around us. And as I pointed out to you, we believe one of our kind of fundamental ideas that we've kind of rallied around over the course of the series together is that if we're going to be love, if we're going to do everything with love, well, we believe that the better we get to know love, the better we'll be able to show love. And so we've been trying to do that, get to know what love is, what it looks like, what it's all about. We've been looking together at both the example of love that God's given to us, specifically in the person of his son, Jesus, who was here 2,000 years ago. And we've been looking together at a very just elaborate and very robust explanation of love that God's given to us by this same character, Paul, in the same letter that we've been talking about together that he wrote to the Corinthian church just a few chapters earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. So we've been looking there, verses 4 to 8, getting to know more about love so that we can better be able to show love to people around us. And we've covered a lot of great ground so far already. If you've been following along, you've been here over the last several weeks, I think we've covered around 9 different descriptions already that Paul gave us. And when you put all these descriptions together, I pointed out to you, it's kind of like a puzzle that Paul's given us here, that when we put all these pieces and descriptions together, it creates this thorough and holistic picture for us of what love is and what love looks like and what love is all about. So reviewing that here quickly, we talked about a few different things over the past few weeks. Several weeks ago, we talked about how love is patient, love is kind, and love does not envy. With love is patient, we said that it's long-suffering. Love chooses to be slow to boil with people. It's one of the things that we extend, one of the ways that we demonstrate love to others by choosing to be patient with them. We said love is kind, that idea of kindness implies this idea of being both good to people and also good for people, both nutritious and what? Delicious, right? Good to and good for. We look for ways to be a blessing to people and also to benefit them. We come around the needs that we have, we extend kindness to them in that way. We talked about how love does not envy. It doesn't get caught up in worrying about what other people have or not wanting others to have what we want. Instead of competing with everybody else around us, love actually makes the challenging, bold, courageous choice to celebrate those around us, celebrate people, to celebrate the good things that are happening, not to live constantly in envy and jealousy, but celebrating the good things as an extension, as an expression of being love to them. Then the next week after that, we talked about how love does not boast and love is not proud. We said that it doesn't puff up and it doesn't over promote. It doesn't try to inflate itself or make itself look or seem bigger than we actually are. It doesn't make a lot of noise and blow out a lot of hot air to try to draw attention to ourselves. Instead of all of that, just as Jesus did with us, it chooses to be humble. It chooses humility and service and to be sacrificial. Instead, we said love does not dishonor others. The idea, there's some translations say it's not rude. We said that it's basically this idea that it doesn't disregard God by devaluing others. It doesn't violate God's standard for how we should treat others and talk to others and think about others, but instead in the words that we speak, the actions that we have, the attitudes that we demonstrate, the thoughts that we have about people, we choose to honor them. So we talked about humility and honor in that week. And then last week we talked about this idea that love is not easily angered, and spent a lot of time there. And I got a lot of feedback from many of you guys. Seemed to really resonate the whole idea of some of the idols that we talked about that we don't have maybe in our homes, but we have them certainly in our hearts. And while they shouldn't be there in the first place, many of us have those things, the idols of comfort and control and significance and respect. And many times, without even realizing it, we have those idols there that are at the center of our lives, the center of our contentment. And when somebody messes with those, it messes with us, right? And it stirs us up to anger and to lashing out, and it provokes us. And Paul says, wait a minute, love is not like that. We have to choose a new and better way. Then we talked about how love keeps no record of wrongs, that there are no scorecards or spreadsheets in love, that we don't keep track of everything that everybody's done against us. We actually choose to not hold things against them. It's really the act of forgiveness, of choosing to forgive just as we through Jesus have been what? Forgiven ourselves, right? And it's bold, it's countercultural, it's not natural for us, but it's the thing that he modeled for us in his love for us. And then he says, come and follow me. It keeps no record of wrongs. And then lastly, we talked about this idea that love rejoices with the truth. And I loved that one. I kind of hit this very quickly last week, but I love this one in the mix because I think it kind of balances out. There's an element in which some of the other descriptions that we've talked about already, they can almost feel, even though they're not easy, they can almost feel a little soft. Like we never wade into tough things. We're just gonna take it easy. We're gonna be kind and gentle and patient and not upset and all these kind of gentle, easy, almost soft things. And then Paul reminds us of this though, that love also rejoices with the truth. And it chooses to bring truth, and it chooses to be truthful with people around us. And so sometimes love, the thing that it requires of us, the most loving thing we can do sometimes is to enter into hard confrontations and enter into hard conversations. And even as it relates to our own lives and our own hearts, to kind of expose ourselves through hard confessions. It chooses to bring truth, believing that truth is best for us, and love always wants what's best for us and for others around us. But not only does it choose to bring truth, it chooses to be truthful, to live in the truth, to not hide and have secrets and all sorts of things that we keep from others or masks that we wear. We live in the truth because love does not delight in evil, but it what? It rejoices with the truth. Covered a lot, haven't we? Talked about a lot of things. And what I want to do with you tonight is then kind of wrap up the descriptions that Paul gave in 1 Corinthians 13. We've got one more week next week. We're going to cover some great stuff with that as well. But I want to kind of wrap up this section of 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 to 8, talking about the last descriptions in addition to the ones we've already talked about together, the last of these that Paul gave us there. So here we have the passage. We've covered all this ground so far, and we said right in the center of all of it is this idea that love is not self-seeking. It's not selfish, but selfless. It's sacrificial, and it's demonstrated in all these different ways. And where we want to end kind of this section tonight is talking about these last things in the last couple of verses, that love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres, and love never fails. So we're going to walk through that together. Again, if you have your notes, you can follow along with me there. And I want to begin with just this first idea that we see here as we continue on, that love always protects. It's really a fascinating word, like so many of them. I mean, it's just poetic how Paul describes love for us here in these verses, and this word is no different. It's a very illustrative word. I think it gives us a great metaphor, a great picture, because this word that Paul used here, that we've translated as protects, when he says love always protects, is a word that actually comes from a root word that literally means roof or shelter. And we have that there in your notes, this idea that To protect, literally, it comes from a word that literally means, it paints this picture for us of a roof over or a shelter from, which I think is such a great image. I mean, we all get that. We all understand that. We understand what a roof provides for us, what a shelter provides for us. I want to spend just a couple minutes talking to you about what I think Paul's talking about here with this. What is he talking about when he says love always protects? It provides a roof over or a shelter from. Well, what's he talking about? A roof over what? And a shelter from what? And I want to share with you, I think there's a lot of things we could talk about with that, but what I want to point out for you tonight that I think is at least part of what Paul's pointing us to here with this is this. You see it in your notes as well, that when Paul says that love always protects, I think part of what he's telling us is that love always chooses to cover shame and to create security. And here's what I mean by that. Last week, we just reviewed this here for a moment. We talked about this idea that love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices with the truth. And as I told you about that, and even as I reminded you of that here tonight, we said that love it doesn't cover things up, right? It doesn't pretend that broken things don't exist. It doesn't pretend that there aren't messes that need to be cleaned up. It doesn't brush things under the rug and try to turn a blind eye to them. Love is willing to go into the hard places because love rejoices with the truth. It's willing to have hard conversations and hard confrontations and hard confessions. It doesn't cover things up. And yet, I think part of what Paul would tell us in the very next line as we read here with protects is that while love does not choose to cover things up, it does choose to kind of cover things over. And let me explain for you what I mean by that and some of the distinction of that when it comes to that. I think when you think of spaces and roofs and shelters and those kinds of things, essentially what Paul's talking about is that for us to love other people, we seek to create spaces, safe spaces, where they can be who they are, kind of in the process or in the journey of becoming all that God has made them to be. I want to describe this for you or kind of summarize it for you. Again, you don't have this in your notes, but you can write this there, that I think when it comes to this idea of covering shame and creating security, love is willing to have the hard confrontations, as we talked about last week. And it's willing to have the hard conversations, again, just like we talked about last week. But here's what I think Paul would say to us this week with this idea that love always protects. We have these hard confrontations and conversations, but only ever with that person and never about that person. Are you with me? Do you see the distinction of what we're talking about here? In other words, we're willing to go into that territory. We don't cover things up, but we do choose out of love to in some way cover things over. We will have those hard conversations and confrontations, but only ever with the person that's involved in that and never, ever about that person. We give them a safe space to be forgiven, to be healed, to work through stuff, and to get better. And here's what I think is so amazing. Just like all the other things that we've talked about so far with love, this is exactly the way that God has chosen to love each and every one of us, right? And I don't know about you, but I'm so thankful for that. And then he invites us and he says, in the same way that I've loved you, just like all of these other things, this is how I want you to love one another, to create safe space for people around you to be themselves, to be transparent, to be open and honest about areas that they're struggling and needing to grow in so that they can grow in those areas. It's all about being a trusted friend, being someone that others can share with and open up to and be authentic and transparent and honest about themselves, that they can enter into that scary ground of the hard confessions that we talked about last week, that you're the kind of person that they can share that with, and you're not gonna cover those things up, but you will, out of love, choose to cover them over, to create a roof or a shelter, a safe space to shelter or cover their shame and to create a space of security where they can grow into all that God has created and made them to be. You see, there's nothing about love that enjoys seeing somebody else be humiliated. There's nothing about love that enjoys seeing somebody else have all of their garbage just drug out in the open for everybody else to see. Again, it doesn't avoid it or pretend that it's not there. It doesn't brush it under the rug. It doesn't cover it up, but it does choose to what? To cover it over. Are you with me? Let me give you an illustration of what this can look like. Again, I could give you a lot of different stories with this tonight, certainly as a dad, as a pastor, as a friend in my own life, ways that people have done this with me. But one example that came to my mind as I was thinking about this actually happened years ago when I was a teacher. I was a Bible teacher teaching Bible classes for middle school and high school students at a Christian school. And of course, everybody sends their kids to those schools at times, or a lot of people do, because they think they're going to be spaces where nothing bad ever happens, and yet all those kids are just as broken and messy as anywhere else. And so some of the same things you'd expect to see in school anywhere else, you see there. And so as a teacher, there were times where I would give some kind of test or quiz or exam in my class, and just like you'd expect to see anywhere else, I'd look out and I would, across the room, I'd see a couple of kids that are trying to work together and cheat on their test, or somebody that's trying to copy off of somebody else. And whenever I would see this happen, when I would catch them in the act of doing this, they didn't know that I saw them doing it, of course, but as I would see this happen, I'd have a choice. I'd have an option of what I could do and how I could respond, right? And when I saw this happen in the class, one option would be to call them out in front of the class, to make a scene about it, make sure everybody knew what I saw and knew what they did, and kind of lay it all out for everybody to know about and to see. Or I could do what I think Paul's challenging us to do here, to choose the way of love instead, to not cover it up, not to pretend that it didn't happen, to pretend that I didn't see it, to pretend that there wasn't something broken that didn't need to be addressed, and just brush it under the rug. Not to do that. Love doesn't do that, because love rejoices with the truth. But instead of that, I didn't have to lay it all out for everyone. Even though I wasn't going to cover it up, I could choose to cover it over and pull them aside afterward, have a conversation, and cover their shame, create a space of security for them where I could help them see the problem with that and address what was going on in their heart and make decisions to help them move in the direction that God wanted them to go. You see, love never covers up, but it does choose to cover over. It rejoices with the truth, but it also chooses to protect and put a roof and a shelter over, to cover shame and to create security. This is one of the things that love does. And I think we all have the same kind of options and choices with people all around us all the time. Think about it for a moment in your home. If you're married with your spouse, perhaps if they're like you or they're like me, they've got areas in their life where they're broken, areas in their life that are messy, that aren't the way they're supposed to be. Perhaps there are even areas in their life that affect you. Perhaps there are even broken, messy areas in their life that are aimed directly at you, right? Some of you have walked through that. You've experienced that. And you have a choice to air it all out, to bring others into it, to complain about it to your buddies, or to choose the way of being love instead, to protect, not to cover it up, but to cover it over, to cover the shame, and to create a place of security where your spouse can grow into the person that God made them to be. Think about it with your kids. This is an easy one for us to really mess up with, right? When our kids make mistakes, when they do things they shouldn't, when they do things that are embarrassing to themselves, or perhaps as their parent, even embarrassing to you. And you have an option, you have a choice. You're gonna air it all out, you're gonna complain about it, you're gonna embarrass them, you're gonna bring all of that out in the open for others to see and to know about and to be aware of, or you're gonna choose what Paul invites us into here, the path of love instead, to be love with them by choosing to protect, not to cover it up, but to cover it over, to put up a roof or a shelter, to cover their shame and to create a space of security where they can grow into the person that God made them to be. With people you work with in your places of employment, you may have people there that you love and are easy to love. You have other people that, man, you'd love to see them fail. And maybe there are moments where they do, or they make mistakes, or they do things actually on purpose that they shouldn't have done, and you're aware of it, and you have a choice to make. A choice to air it out, to talk about it with others, to make a scene, to bring it out in the open for others to know about and for all to see. Maybe you'll even benefit from it in some way, because you'll get a promotion and they won't, or you'll get credit for something and they won't get the credit. And you're gonna have to choose between going that way and going the path of being love instead. Not covering it up, but covering it over. As an expression of love to them. Choosing to protect, create a shelter, to put up a roof, to cover their shame, and to create a space of security where they can grow into the people that God has made them to be. Even with other men in your life, one of the reasons we set this up the way we do at Man Day Monday, around a table like this, is that we hope these are spaces for you where you can share about what's going on in your life. We hope that these kind of table groups that you're a part of in many ways are like little shelters. They're little roofs over your head where you can open up and be transparent and be real. And as people around you, people in your life, whether it's across a table at breakfast at some restaurant in town, or it's a table like this, or it's a phone conversation or whatever it might be, as other guys open up to you and they share with you things that are going on in their life, and they share with you their struggles and the things that they're working through and the challenges that they're facing, as they share that with you, you have a choice between what is so natural and normal in our world of airing that out and sharing that with others, or choosing to be love to them instead by offering them a sense of protection, by putting up a roof, a shelter, by choosing to create that safe space for them where their shame is covered and there's security for them to grow into the men that God made them to be. Here's what I've learned about myself and what I think is true about most of you as well. We all need that from other people. Am I right? I mean, we all need others to create a roof and a shelter, some space to cover our shame where we can be open and transparent about the things that we're struggling with, and to create a space of security where we can be ourselves as we are on a journey, though, toward becoming all that God has made us to be. We all need that from other people. We do. And because of that, and in light of that, I think we ought to also seek to be that for other people as well. It's one of the things that I think Paul would challenge us with, because love always protects. It creates a shelter, a roof. It covers shame, creates security, a safe space for people not to have everything aired out. It doesn't cover things up, doesn't pretend they don't exist, but it does choose to cover them over and to give a space where we can become all that God has made us to be. Second thing that I want to talk about with you tonight, not only does love always protect, but we also, as we read on, we see that love always trusts and always hopes. And I've combined these two together, kind of like I've done a few weeks ago with a few others of these descriptions that Paul's given to us here. And while each of these kind of communicate their own unique ideas, they also really play well together. I think Paul combined them in some way, or listed them together as a way of really complementing each other. And I want to unpack these and explain for you what I think Paul's challenging us with here in this idea that love always trusts and always hopes. First of all, this idea that love always trusts, the word that he used here that's been translated as trusts, is a word that literally means to believe. And one of the things that I think is part of what Paul's talking about here is this, that when he says that love always trusts, he essentially is saying to us, love always chooses to believe for the best of whoever it is that we're choosing to love. It's not blind, it's not ignorant, it's not foolish, it's not naive, it's not pretending. Again, it doesn't cover things up or pretend that there aren't broken things or messy things. It's not about just being blind or ignorant to all of that, but even in the midst of all of that, it chooses to continue to believe for the best, to take an optimistic approach and a posture like that with others. It means loving them, having faith in who God made them to be and in who they're capable of becoming. I think that the idea of hope is very similar to this as well. When Paul says that love always hopes, it's kind of an additional thought to what I just talked about here. Not only does it believe for the best, but the word that Paul used here that's been translated hope is a word that literally means to look forward to good. In other words, when he says that love always hopes, the idea is that love is always looking ahead to what could be or what even should be down the road. It's always looking ahead to the light at the end of the tunnel, to the good future that could be there with God's work and presence and power at work in somebody's lives and in somebody's life. In other words, love chooses to always believe that nobody is ever beyond hope, that nobody is ever a lost cause. Let me summarize it for you this way. You have this in your notes there that I think kind of captures what we're talking about when Paul describes love this way. I believe that essentially what Paul's telling us is this, that love believes that there's a good version of others that they were made to become. Everybody. And it believes that they can become that version with God's work in their lives. This is significant. Sometimes this is easy to do with people that are easy to love. This is easy to do with people that we have kind of an innate care for, people in our family or close friends or whoever it might be. It's a little bit more difficult to believe this and to hope this and to trust this, though, with people that we don't naturally care about as much, or people that bother us, or people that are different than us, or people that annoy us, or they frustrate us in some way, or there are some people around us that seem too far gone to continue to trust, or to continue to hope, or to continue to believe. But I think Paul would stand before us and say, wait a minute, but love always trusts. And love always hopes. It believes that there's a good version of everyone that we come in contact with, that they were actually created by God to become. There's good there that God had in mind for them. It may be buried beneath all sorts of things that are not good, but love chooses to believe that for every person, there's a good version of them that they were made to become. And it also believes that every person, no matter how far gone they seem to be, can become that with God's work in their lives. One of the things I want to point out for you that I think is really important with this is that our hope in this, our trust in this, our belief in this on behalf of somebody else is never based on that person or on all the great potential that they bring to the table. You see, it's not based on their great potential, but rather it's based on our great and incredible God who's made incredible promises and who has incredible power to fulfill those promises of what he wants to do in each and every person's life. And so we continue to trust and we continue to hope and we continue to believe that there's a good version that each person was made to become and that they can become that with God's work in your life. I want to give you an illustration of this that came to mind as I thought about this and sharing this with all of you as well. This actually happened several years ago as well. Before I came on staff at Pathway, I was pastoring in another church and working with a whole different group of people at the time. And there were a couple guys that really illustrated this well for me. Actually, one guy in particular in the ways that he loved somebody else in our church. We had this guy in our church that I met a couple years after I started there, and he was an interesting character. He was loud, he was obnoxious, in many ways very gifted, very talented, but he was a mess in a lot of areas in his life. He was egotistical, he was unhealthy, he was an alcoholic, he was a ladies' man. Because of that, he had a really hard time holding his life and his family and his kids and his jobs and all sorts of other things together. And I remember when I first met him, it came at a moment of crisis. Again, one other thing that kind of in this cycle of things that had gone wrong in his life had happened. And so we met each other. And over time, something really fascinating began to happen. I actually saw this guy connect with another guy in our church. And he was almost the complete opposite. He was a physician in our church. He had grown up in the church. He was born and raised in that church. At the time, he's probably mid-50s. And so he had lived his life growing up in this church. He was Mr. Black and White. He knew everything he believed. He knew every reason why he believed it. There were really no gray areas in life. I mean, it was cut and dry. He knew where he stood on every issue. In some ways, he was somewhat legalistic. He was definitely a rule-following kind of guy. And somehow, in some God way, these two kind of struck up a relationship, a friendship together. And it was an interesting pair. I mean, you would never pair the two of them together. If you were trying to match compatibility, you would never put these two guys together. And over actually several years of my one friend who was making all kinds of mistakes and finding himself in all kinds of struggles and challenges, he just was in this cycle of one thing after another. And over time, if I'm just being very honest and transparent with you as a pastor tonight, I know you're not supposed to be this way, but I was getting kind of tired of him. I mean, every time he'd call, sorry, another DUI, I'm in trouble again, or I'm in jail, can someone come visit me? Or I'm in the hospital again because I've been self-medicating in different ways, or my wife's upset with me because I've been out at the bars and hanging with people I shouldn't have been hanging out with, or I lost another job and I have no way to provide for myself. I mean, I love this guy, but after a while, I was starting to think he's just not worth my time. I mean, he's a mess. He has no desire to clean things up, and I was getting tired of him. And yet I was convicted and challenged in the example of my other friend, this doctor friend of ours who was there, again, worlds different, didn't wrestle with hardly any of the same things that this other guy wrestled with, but for some reason, God had put him on his heart and he had chosen to love him. And one of the ways that he loved him, even though many of us were ready to write this guy off, even though many of us were ready to say, you know what, maybe there's a better church for you down the road, he continued to love him. He continued to believe that there was a good version of him that he was made to become. He continued to be there for him and to support him. He continued to believe that against all of our better judgment and against all of our better guesses, and if you were placing bets on this guy, nobody would bet for him. Nobody wanted to stand in his corner. And yet my doctor friend continued to love him, believing that he could actually still become that better version that God had created him to be with God's work in his life. And this is what I think Paul's challenging us to do. This is what I think he's inviting us into when he says that love always trusts and always hopes. It's not blind, it's not naive, it's not foolish. It's not just rose-colored lenses that, again, covers things up that are broken and pretends they don't exist. No, it enters into those hard places believing that there's a good version of that person that God made them to become, and believing that that person can actually become that with God's work in their lives. This is one of the things that love does. It always trusts, it always hopes. And then the last thing I want to talk about with you tonight, actually that story illustrates well that love always perseveres and never fails. And this is so key as well. Again, I think the story I just shared with you is a great illustration of this. As my doctor friend persevered and endured and continued to love this guy, even when he was very unlovable. Not only was he demonstrating what it looks like to trust and to hope, but I think he was also demonstrating what it looks like to persevere and to never fail. Let me explain for you these words and what Paul's described for us here, just like so many of the others, so much to unpack just from the words themselves. The word that's been translated here, perseveres, is a word that literally means to remain under. It's a compound word, just a smash up of two other words that implies this idea of remaining under. And the picture that it paints is almost this idea of like you or me standing underneath tremendous weight. There's a weight on our shoulders, some kind of, maybe even like weights, or some kind of big, huge boulder or something that's heavy that's pushing us down and pressing us down, and yet we stand strong and stand firm. We remain under the pressure and under the burden. We don't give up and we don't give in. We don't fall to it. We don't surrender to it. We persevere. We endure. This is the picture that Paul gives to us. It's very similar to the next word, the word fails. When he says that love never fails, the word that literally means wilts or withers. And in Paul's day, it was a word used to describe the petals of a withered flower that would fall off or fall away from a stem to the ground. And I think what Paul was trying to say to us is that love never does that. It doesn't change with the seasons. It doesn't fade away over time. It doesn't blow here and there with the different circumstances or situations in life. It continues to endure. It remains up under. It perseveres, and it never wilts or withers or fades or falls away. Not only is this the explanation of love that God's given to us through Paul here, I think this is a great opportunity just to remind us again of God's tremendous example of love that he's demonstrated to each and every one of us. Because God has loved each of us in this exact same way. Think about your own life. Think about your own faults, your own messiness, your own failures, your own dysfunction, your own rebellion against God, your own middle fingers toward God, the things that you do to say to God, God, not interested, I'm gonna do things my own way. You think about that for a moment for you. And then you think about God's relentless, unending, persevering, never wilting, never withering kind of love that he's given to you. Over and over again, God has been patient with us, long-suffering, slow to boil, as we talked about. Over and over again, he's been kind toward us, good to us and good for us. He has celebrated us, the good things in our lives. He's been humble with us. He has chosen to honor and esteem us, as we talked about several weeks ago. He's been slow to anger with us. He's offered forgiveness to us, offered to remove the things that were on the record that we had. He's held no record against us. He offers truth to us, and he's chosen to be truthful and trustworthy with us. He's protected us and created safe space for us to be ourselves en route to who he created us to be. He's believed the best for us. His love has remained up under, and it has never faded or fallen away. Aren't you grateful for God's incredible love that he's demonstrated for us? And then he says to us, now you go reflect what you've experienced of me to the world around you. As we talked about in one of our weeks together, we said that all of us were made in God's image. And part of the implication of that is that we were made to reflect God to the world around us. And if God is love, if he's all these things, then we have the opportunity to reflect him by choosing to be these things as well. So here's my final challenge for you tonight as it relates to this idea that love never fails, that love always perseveres. I want you to take a moment. I just want you to open up your heart to whoever maybe God might put on your heart or bring to mind for you just quickly in this moment together. I want you just to think for a moment, even ask God, God, who is it in my life that I just need to be reminded of this with, that your love has always persevered and never failed with me. So who is it in my life, God? And I need to be reminded and challenged tonight to choose to be love in this way with them. Maybe for some of you, it's your spouse. Maybe your spouse has been hard to love. Maybe your spouse has not been very loving toward you. Maybe they've not made things easy. Maybe it doesn't feel very lovey. Maybe it doesn't feel very loving between you. I have couples that have met with me over the years. Sometimes they come in and a husband or a wife will sit there and they'll say, well, I just don't love her anymore. Or she'll say, well, I just don't love him anymore. And I know what they're saying. They say, I don't feel very lovey here, right? And I always play with that a little bit. And I go back to what we talked about in week 1 and I say, well, why did you stop? And it always kind of stops them in their tracks initially because they're thinking, what do you mean? Why did I? It's not like I had a choice in it. We just don't love each other anymore. There's no love between us. And I say, well, you know what? I understand that with friendship love. We talked about phileo love, right? I understand that if it doesn't feel very friendly between you. I understand that with eros love. Maybe there's nothing romantic or physically intimate. Maybe that's not there for you, but while those are great kinds of love and important and helpful and useful, those aren't, and when you promise to love each other until death parts you, those weren't the kinds of love that actually God was interested in. He was talking about this kind of love, the kind of love, agape love, that actually is a choice. You can give that love to anybody you choose to give that to, even your enemies, right? Because it's demonstrated through our actions and through our attitudes and the ways that we show our commitment to somebody through the choices we make toward them. Maybe some of you are here tonight and it's your spouse. You've got to make a choice if you're going to be love, to persevere, to never fail in your love toward them. Maybe some of you, it's one of your kids or all of your kids. Maybe they're rough. Maybe they're making tough choices. Maybe they've got their back turned toward you. Maybe they're doing things actively to hurt you. And you have a choice to give up, to be crushed under the pressure of that, to wilt or wither, or to be love in the way that God has been love with us and to persevere and to never fail. For others of you, maybe it's not just in the context of your home, maybe it's your place of work, maybe it's neighbors, maybe it's someone in your extended family, somebody you go to school with, maybe it's somebody you consider an enemy, maybe it's somebody you haven't talked to in years. And I just want to challenge you to be open to where Jesus might be wanting to lead you as he says, don't miss how I've loved you. And now come and follow me.